So now that we have put some time into this beautiful activity of empathizing with those who don't share our faith and thinking about them and where they are, now we come to the next part of the spiritual conversation curve. So we have their spiritual posture along the bottom, and then what we have along the top are these prayerful responses. And so ways that we can be thoughtful about how to respond to someone in a prayerful way. And so you see there's corresponding ones. So for those who are unreceptive, the way that we kind of, our goal or kind of how we prayerfully respond is by gaining a hearing, right? They're closed off, they don't trust, and so our goal and what we're praying for is that we would gain a hearing with them. For those who are receptive, our prayerful response is to give good news, right? They're open to hearing about the faith, and so we want to be giving good news to them. And for those who are seeking, the most helpful, servant-hearted thing we can do and be endeavoring towards is to help guide them toward faith. So these are responses, right? It's a way of responding to where someone is on their spiritual journey, but they have to be prayerful responses, right? Because let me ask you this question. Can you force anyone to trust you? No. You will trust me. It turns out you cannot force someone to trust you. And so it has to involve prayer. God has to be at work in helping you gain a hearing. Likewise, we're not always going to be perfect on our own on having the opportunity to give good news. We need God to be a part of that and triggering that to happen. And can any of us guide anyone toward faith? Can you make someone have faith in Jesus? I really hope your answer is no, because that is the answer. You know, God is the author of salvation. We're not. You can't force anyone or make anyone have faith. And so that's why it has to be a prayerful response, that we can be praying for these things. We would pray that someone would gain a hearing. We can pray that someone would have good news given to them. We can pray that they would be guided toward faith, that God himself would call them home to him. We pray for it. And we see this in Paul too, right? We were looking at Colossians earlier, where Paul was encouraging people to be wise in how they walked with those who don't share their faith. These are the verses that Paul wrote just before those verses, and they have everything to do with prayer. Will you read these words with me now? Continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray also for us that God may open to us a door for the word, to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison, that I may make it clear which is how I ought to speak. And so it's very clear here, continue steadfastly in prayer, right? Paul is an advocate of praying for all things in life, in particular, praying for the non-believers that are in your life. But it's one thing to kind of pray in a vague way. And some people will have lists of people, Father, I'm praying for these people, that they would come home to you. And that's a wonderful thing to pray. But what I find interesting is that Paul actually mentions ways of strategically praying and praying for different things. Notice on the one hand, he prays that God would move supernaturally in their life. Notice where he says, pray for us that God may open to us a door for the word. That there are certain doors, God has to be the one who opens the door. He has to be the one who does it. And so it's praying, God, I pray that you would open these doors for these people to be able to take another step closer to you. I know there's barriers. I know there's things in the way. Would you send your spirit and open the door? So it's praying that God does something. But then it's really interesting. He also says, would you also pray for me? Don't just pray that God's going to be opening a door. Pray that I would, use my voice well when it's opened, right? Notice what he says at the end, that I may make it clear, the mystery of Christ clear, which is how I ought to speak. And so he's encouraging the believers in Colossae, pray that God would do something. And pray that when he does, that I would do something as God equips me to do it, right? So open the door, pray that God would open the door, and then pray for me that I would be able to speak clearly. And there's kind of a tick-tock of prayer here, if you will. I pray for them, but I also pray that God would use me in their life. And this is often how we pray for things, right? If there are any parents here, you know that you don't just pray for your kids, right? Where, Father, would you help Simon meet with encouragement during his day? You know that you also pray for yourself as their parent, right? Father, would you help them and give me better wisdom on how to parent them through this season, right? Like I'm praying for them and I'm praying that you would use me to help them in that. Those of you who are in positions of leadership or supervision, as believers, we often pray for the people we lead, right? But I don't know about you. I don't just pray for the people I lead. Then I say, and Father, be with me as their boss. Like, give me wisdom for them and help me lead them well. And it's the exact same TikTok prayer principle here, that if your friend is unreceptive, part of your prayerful response is to say, Father, I'm going to pray for them, and I'm going to pray that you would open a door, that they would gain a hearing, that they would build some trust. And Father, if you want to use me to do that, help me be trustworthy. Help me be a positive influence in their life. Help me serve them in such a way that you gain a hearing for your gospel. Does that make sense? It's kind of praying for them and praying for you in their life. The same thing if you have a friend who's receptive, right? I hit this place with Lucy when I was, oh my gosh, she's totally receptive. And I said, Father, I just pray that she would hear of your good news, that she would hear good things about your gospel. And if you want to use me to do that when we get together for breakfast next week, help me know what to say. And help me say it in a way that's clear and that's winsome and that means something. Does that make sense? It's this prayerful response. Same thing if you have a friend who is seeking. You can't make them trust Jesus with their life. No one can. And so you lift them up and you say, Father, I pray you would open that door. I rebuke the enemy in any of the ways he wants to keep them from your kingdom. And would you open the door? Would you call them home to you? And Father, if you want to use me as like some kind of awkward Sherpa in that process, okay. Help me be as helpful as possible in answering their questions and helping guide them in their faith. And so that is this second part of the spiritual conversation curve, discerning where someone is in their journey and then prayerfully responding. So I'd like us to do that now. So if you pull your card out again, you now may open it up, and you'll notice that the second panel looks like this. It says, I'm praying God will help me. And these correspond to the first column. And so if you checked unreceptive, at this point, check, help me gain a hearing. I'm praying that you would help gain a hearing. If you checked receptive, check give good news. If you checked seeking, check guide toward faith. And then here's what I would like you to do. I'd like you to write your TikTok prayer in the detail section. And so, I hit a place with Lucy, for example, where I changed it from unreceptive to receptive. And then on my card, I'm not making this up. I just carry this around with me. I pull it out of my wallet and I'm like, well, I think she's receptive. So what should I be praying for now? And so I checked on here, give good news. And then for the details, I wrote specific things. God, would you do this in her life? Would you do this in her life? And then I wrote the other part of the prayer. Would you give me wisdom to do this or to be helpful in this way? So go ahead and check your prayerful response and then write within the details the two parts of your prayer for them. Let's take some time to do that on our own. Now that we have written down ways that we can be in prayer for our friend, I would invite you where you are seated in pairs to actually lift these prayers up. Let's go live right now and talk to God on behalf of our friends. Now that we have prayed for our friends, we've spent a little time discerning their spiritual posture. We've spent a little bit of time tasting what it can be like to prayerfully respond to them. When are we actually going to figure out what to say, right? Wasn't that the promise we started with a while ago? Is we get in this dilemma where I'm in relationship, I'm a conversation partner with someone who doesn't share my faith, and how do I figure out what to talk about? Well, it's all the work ahead of time that helps us figure out what to talk about. Having empathy for where they are, being in prayer for them, helps us discern the best kind of conversation to have with them. And this is the third part of the spiritual conversation curve. You have their spiritual posture along the bottom, you have the prayerful response along the top, and then what we have through the middle are 6 conversation types. Now, in reality, there are millions of conversation types. And every conversation we have with another human being is beautiful and unique and special. But relative to where someone is in their spiritual journey, we have found that there are 6 basic conversation types that are more helpful at different parts of the journey. And so that's what we're going to spend some time talking about right now. You see the 6 right here. You can chat, relate, share, connect, explore, or clarify. But what do all those mean? And when is it more helpful to lean into or try to spark each of those kinds of conversations? Let's take it a third at a time. Let's start over here with the blue area. If you're in relationship and conversation with someone who's unreceptive to the Christian faith, that can be a little bit scary, right? I mean, I have to admit, don't you feel for this mustachioed gentleman on the right here? I mean, this guy, his arms are crossed and, and sometimes it can feel like weird to be in relationship with someone who's unreceptive to the Christian faith, who's distrustful. I remember when I lived in Boulder, Colorado, I met one of my neighbors, Rose, when she knocked on my door the week I moved in, and I thought, oh, she's coming to greet me and maybe bring me some chocolates. I don't know, kind of welcome me to the neighborhood. No, Rose had come over to upbraid me for how I was doing my recycling wrong. And so she took me over to the shared communal recycling area, and she's setting me straight on all this stuff. And somewhere in the recycling room, and I don't even remember how this came up, but she let loose some comment about those Christians. And she said it in that way, which made it very clear to me, I didn't even have this language back then, but I had the sense that probably my next move is not to summarize the gospel message for her. I had a sense probably that's not my next conversational move. I mean, I'm not that emotionally intelligent, but just enough to know that's not the first move. So how do you enter into conversation when you may want to talk about your faith, but they do not want to talk about your faith? You could bring it up anyways and just further dig the hole of distrust. That is an option. Or you could graciously adapt, as Paul did, as Jesus did, and as Paul encouraged us to. You could graciously adapt to where they are. If they're unreceptive, you could start by just chatting. And as you see here, chatting about life builds trust. And so I didn't start with my friend Rose by saying, speaking of Christians, and launch into, a defense of, the Crusades or something like that. We talked about the weather. And we talked about my beautiful kids. I only had 2 kids when we first moved in, and we talked about my kids, and we talked about her, just everyday things. We just talked about everyday things. And you guys know this, right? That chatting about everyday things, it builds trust. It's a very human thing to do. It's a very safe place to start. And it draws people closer to each other. And so that's what I did with Rose. I didn't push the issue I'm going to bring Jesus up because I'm a Christian. If I don't do it, God will be embarrassed. No, I just talk about the weather. It's clear you're unreceptive, so I want to build trust. That's part of gaining a hearing, right, is gaining trust. And so we did that. Now, there is another kind of conversation type, which is a little bit deeper, which is relating. And as you see here, relating to each other's joys and pains deepens our connection with each other, right? And so talking about your joys in life or your pains in life, that's a little bit different, right? But eventually Rose and I got there where we weren't just talking about the weather, but we were talking about how the weather affected her arthritis and made it hard for her to go upstairs to her bedroom. And could I help her by getting something from the second floor for her? We didn't just talk about my kids and how beautiful and wonderful they were, but we also started talking about some of my struggles as a parent and some of the frustrations that I had. And there's something about relating about joys and pains in life that it deepens the connection that you have with someone else. And this is an integral part of gaining a hearing, is building trust in that way. I know that as believers, often we think the most faithful thing to do must be the most awkward thing to do, right? And boy, I really don't want to bring Jesus up. It feels like totally inappropriate. I probably should. But if someone is unreceptive, even though it feels faithful and might be good for your prayer life, man, I prayed my way through that. That was really risky for me. It might not actually be wise. Does that make sense? And remember Paul, he said, walk in wisdom towards others. And so sometimes the appropriate thing is to chat with someone, to build trust, or to relate, to deepen the trust that you have. And maybe God will open a door and he will work in their life in such a way that those conversations he uses to help you gain a hearing. So I'd like us to do a little role play at this point, and in part because maybe as believers you're thinking, these are silly things that we do. I would posit this, and I think the research backs me up here. In our post-Christian, postmodern era, sometimes chatting and relating are thoroughly evangelistic activities. It is the appropriate thing to do to build a bridge with someone. So we believers need to get better at this. So I'd like us to role play. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to turn to someone near you, and I would like you to practice chatting. And so here's the question I want you to answer. What did you do last weekend? So one part of each pair, raise your hand. Who's going to raise their hand first? Someone from each pair has to raise their hand. Okay, yeah, there, Paul, finally. A finger is enough. The person whose hand is raised, ask the other person, what'd you do this weekend? And then you reply. Okay, I'm going to interrupt your loud chatting right now. I just want to ask a few of you, what are some of the virtues of a chatting conversation? Just based on what that felt like, what are some of the virtues of chatting? It's active, you do active listening. It's loud, right? There's an energy behind chatting. That's really fun. You can just enter right into it, right? No one was like, what, to chat? Yeah.
It's not very threatening.
It's not very threatening. Yeah, you can go right into it. Based on watching you guys chat just now, one of the things I could say about the virtues of chatting is that chatting is high energy. Anyone can enter in. It's very welcoming. And the other beautiful thing about chatting in our day and age is that sometimes God can use a chatting or relating conversation to open a door and to help gain a hearing with a non-believer who is in your life. And so that sometimes they would actually get to the place of, they once were unreceptive, but now they're receptive and they're more open. So if someone is receptive to the good news, they're receptive to hearing about the faith, what do you talk about with them? Is that when you go right to, now let me draw a cross on a napkin and diagram the Christian faith? You know, what's best to talk about? What we have found is the two best conversations to start with someone who is receptive is a sharing conversation, and then in this order, a connecting conversation. What's a sharing conversation? As we have here, sharing Jesus at work in your life affirms his relevance. And so a sharing conversation is not where you are summarizing the gospel. A sharing conversation is where you are sharing a story, first person, from your life, something God has done in your life recently. And when you share Jesus at work in your life, that affirms his relevance to the person that you're talking to. Notice that the overarching goal here is not give the good news. If it were give the good news, you would want to give a gospel summary. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about giving good news to people. And part of giving good news is saying, here's something Jesus has done in my life. And that affirms his relevance. It helps them see maybe Jesus is kind of for real. Maybe there's something to this after all. So Lucy, our second breakfast together, by that point I had in my cart and I checked it before I went to breakfast the second time to remind me of what we had talked about and kind of where I thought she was in her journey. And so I was going into it thinking, if I can find a place, if God creates a place, opens a door for me to share something he's done in my life, I'm going to be looking for that opportunity. Well, she was sharing more about this high school experience. Remember, she went to church. She was treated terribly. She was marginalized. It was horrible. And she was kind of processing what that did to her and how she had this bitterness inside of her. And she just carries that with her. And how hard that was for her. And at the right place in the conversation, again, I wasn't looking, oh, speaking of, if you were hit by a bus, do you know where you would be tonight? It wasn't like some weird conversation trick. I felt like God opened a door for me to share with her about a relationship I had where I'd been hurt by someone. And I had all this venom inside of me. Like, I was so angry at them. And I confessed it to Jesus and kind of said, look at this venom inside of me. This is terrible. Help me. I can't get over it. I'm stuck. And how Jesus, over a week period, had I don't know how he did it. He just drained the venom out of me. And the next time I saw that person, it was gone. I had prayed for help and said, God, I don't know what to do with this venom. I'm so sorry, Father. Help me with it. And he did. And so I shared that story with Lucy to kind of illustrate, to empathize and say, I know what it's like to have that kind of bitterness and that difficulty. One time, Jesus drained it out of me. And she was very fascinated by this. But this wasn't ancient history. This had happened recently. It was a real thing in my life. Now, part of the problem of sharing like this is if you're sharing about something cool Jesus has done in your life, usually it involves something uncool you've done. Right? I mean, it's usually pretty vulnerable because the story arc is usually, I'm kind of a mess, or I've gotten in this trouble, and Jesus kind of helped me in this way. So it was vulnerable, and I had that thought like, will it be a bad witness if she knows that a pastor had venom for someone else? Who cares? It's true. And it's my story. And that's part of the vulnerability of it helps people see the relevance of Jesus. It can be difficult to do that. And maybe you're like, I'd rather memorize something and burp it out than tell other people about Jesus' work in my life and what he's working on in my life. But it might be wisest to do this. Remember the man who was born blind? There was a man born blind and Jesus healed him. And everyone was up in a hissy fit. All the religious leaders in Jesus' day were like, how can he healed on the Sabbath? Jesus shouldn't have done that. And they kept going back to the guy who had been healed and saying, well, what happened to you? And he's like, so let me go over it again. I was blind. And then Jesus came and put some mud on my face and I can see now. And then they're like, run, they're rending their clothes. And they're like, all these debates and they bring in all these impressive people and they're like, bring him back, ask him, what happened to you? And he's like, all I have is my story. Like, I really, really have been blind my whole life. Like, I was not able to see. And then Jesus came, and now I can see. And what I love about that story is that all of their posturing, all of their debate, all of their rhetoric is absolutely undone by an honest story. By this humble guy who Jesus worked in his life. That's all he knows. He didn't know how to speak well. He had no training or anything. But there's something powerful and beautiful about people seeing the gospel lived out in 4 dimensions. The 4th dimension is time. And when you hear someone's story, Jesus at work in their life, people see the truth of the gospel in 4 dimensions. And it affirms his relevance. And then from there, and I would say probably usually only from there, there's always exceptions, you can move on to a connecting conversation if God opens the door. And this is where we connect Jesus to daily life to reveal the good news. So this goes from subjective, here's my experience, to the objective, where I'm connecting and I'm saying, not just did Jesus do this for me, Jesus does this for people. So this was later in the conversation when she was leaning in, well, how do you do that? And da-da-da. I moved into a connecting conversation and I was actually mentally consulting this in my head, like, okay, then connect it. And so I said, well, Jesus was kind of into forgiveness. Jesus was really into reconciliation. And in fact, the early Christians talked about the dividing walls of hostility coming down. It was like a hallmark of Jesus's kingdom was people reconciling with each other. And I said, Lucy, he's kind of into this. In fact, if you pray to him, he may be able to help even you find reconciliation. It's a possibility. I experienced it, and he might be able to do that for you too. Do you see the difference between those 2 conversations? On the one hand, saying, this is just my story, and sometimes that's all you can talk about. But there are other times when you can take it a step further and say, and I'm actually going to connect Jesus to an everyday issue. We have issues with each other. Jesus has an answer for that. Does that make sense, the difference between those? So what I would like us to do is role play again, and we're going to role play a sharing conversation. So the person who spoke last time, right, who told about your weekend, I would like you to turn to your conversation partner and ask them this question. What's something Jesus has done in your life in the last couple months? Go ahead. Based on the tone in the room during that exercise, things were a little bit quieter, right? There's something a little more vulnerable about sharing some of your own canned goods, as the Germans would say. And so you don't want to say it as loud. Some of you gave me dirty looks like, I really have to talk about my life? So it can be vulnerable to share about what Jesus is doing in your life. But I will say this, in our postmodern, post-Christian landscape, sometimes it is the wisest evangelistic activity you can do is a sharing conversation and a connecting conversation. And sometimes, if God is working, if he's opening the doors at the time, sometimes your friends will move from receptive to actually seeking, where they're leaning forward and they want to get this figured out and they have questions. If you are sitting across the table from a friend who's seeking, what's the best stuff to talk about? Well, here we have an exploring conversation and a clarifying conversation. The fourth time Lucy and I got together, she said, by the way, I have some questions. And I thought, oh, okay, great. Who knows what kind of questions she would have. And she brought out a piece of paper where she had a couple dozen questions written down. And I thought, in my head, I consulted the curve and I went, I think we're going downhill now. I'm pretty sure she's seeking if she has these questions. It's not a guarantee because some non-Christians ask questions of Christians because it's a safe way of relating, right? Like, I'd rather not really relate. So can I ask you questions about hell? I mean, that's safer to talk about. But her questions were very genuine. And so I consulted the curve and I was like, oh, what do I do? What do I do? I have an exploring conversation with her. And as you see here, exploring questions about faith encourages searching. I think sometimes when we're with someone who is seeking, we can kind of freak out and think, I shouldn't be the one to talk to you. Is there a pastor in the house? Somewhere, is there a pastor to answer these questions? But in reality, they don't need beautiful answers. They don't need quick answers. They don't need pristine answers. They need someone to walk alongside them and to hold their question with humility, and then to hold some of the biblical texts, and then to wrestle through that with them. They need an awkward person to walk with them and say, let's handle that together. And actually exploring questions with someone and saying, well, let me hear the question. That's a great question. By the way, any question they ask is a great question, even if it's not a great question. Like, even if there's 4 bad assumptions embedded into the question, it's a great question because it's their question and they're willing to ask it. And so you affirm their question and then just explore it with them. Well, why do you ask that question? And well, let's explore it together. And then just say, as I ask that question, there's a couple of texts that come to mind for me. And can I share with you how I handle those? And so, and that's what I did with Lucy, right? One of her questions was, how could all-loving God send people to hell? And I said, that's a great question. Inside, I'm thinking, dang, that's a hard one. But I said, that's a great question. And I said, I've asked that question myself a lot. And can I share with you some of the texts that have helped me kind of wrestle through that? She said, yeah, I would love that. And we got our Bibles out and we started looking at those. That's what an exploring conversation is all about. Not giving quick answers, but celebrating someone's questions and exploring them with them. That's what they need. One of the most beautiful things you can say is, I don't know. Should we find out together? Let's find out together. You may think that that's a bad witness and they'll think Christians don't know anything. No, if they know you, they've already figured that out, right? And so just be honest and say to them, I don't know. Let's figure that out together. That is actually a really wise thing. And here's what it does. It encourages searching because you get to model searching right alongside them. And show them how to search. And it celebrates searching. It celebrates curiosity. And so that's one of the things that we can do. But that won't get us all the way there. And here's the reason why. Even with all of the questions that Lucy brought to me and all the questions your friend may ask you, there's no guarantee that they're going to ask the single question that ultimately they're going to have to wrestle with. And that's this: what is the core of the gospel? And that's why we need clarifying conversations. A clarifying conversation, as we have it here, is where you clarify the costs and rewards of following Jesus. That prepares someone for faith. One of the things that I've realized, it shouldn't be a huge aha moment, but I had an aha moment when I realized, walking with different non-Christians don't know how to come to faith. They don't know how to become Christians. Like, they need help doing that. And likewise, they don't necessarily know what the core of the gospel is. And they may need the believer in their life who they trust and who they're walking with to pose the question for them. So I did this for Lucy after working through many questions. This was we had a breakfast and a lunch, working through the list. And eventually I said, there's a question I was thinking of. I wonder if I could ask one question too, and that we wrestle with together. Great. She said, that's great. And I said, my question is this: what's the core? Like, if you boil it all down, what's the core of the gospel? And you know what she said? She had picked up on my modeling. She went, what a great question. And so we began wrestling with that together. And this is where, like, a memorized summary of the gospel is really, really helpful, right? Like the bridge diagram where you draw on a napkin two cliffs and humanity separated from God, and a cross which is handily and perfectly the exact width of the chasm, or the Romans road where you memorize certain verses from the letter to the Romans as a way of summarizing the gospel. Those things are great. Like, having a memorized summary now is when it becomes really important, because you need that, and they need you to be able to summarize the gospel. Now, I'm not going to recommend any one way of doing that. There's gobs of ways of doing it. I guess I would just say this: just choose one way. Just something that resonates with you. Choose one biblical metaphor and have that be the metaphor you go to, right? God is our Father, and we're like these kids who've run away. And then in some of us, we come to our senses and we go, I think I want to go home. I think I know I'm dirty and I smell like pigs and I've done terrible things. I just want to go home. Like, maybe that's the metaphor you choose. And then you say to your friend, that's the core of the gospel. And do you feel like God's calling you home? Do you want to return to him now and say, I know I stink like pigs and I've done terrible things. Forgive me. Will you welcome me into your home? Or maybe the metaphor you choose is atonement, right? We're all sinful. We're like birds who've been dipped in an oil spill. And none of us can fly anymore, and we're spoiled by the fall and the sin, and none of us is living life as we're meant to live it. None of us. And what Jesus did on the cross, it's hard to get oil out of feathers, but what he did on the cross by spilling his blood and sacrificing his very life, that blood can actually wash away all of the sin, all of the guilt, all of the judgment that we are due, and we become like birds again in the sight of God, and we can fly. Does that make sense? There are so many different metaphors in the Gospels that you can choose, or use the bridge diagram, the Romans road, something. Just have something that you have as a go-to. One exercise that we're going to do together right now is, I would like for us to practice a clarifying conversation. And so what I'd like you to do is, the person who had to get vulnerable last time, I would like you to turn back to your conversation partner and ask them this question: what's the core of the gospel? I'm going to start bringing us back together. Great. As we come back together, I can tell, based on some of what I was perceiving and listening to, that some of us, it was really natural to clarify the core of the gospel, and others of us were like, I should choose one thing and get better at it. I need to be better equipped to give a gospel summary. So regardless, if a friend is seeking, these are two wise ways that we can walk with them: through exploring their questions with them and through clarifying the costs of the gospel. And for some of them, if God opens the door, he may then guide them toward faith using your imperfect conversations with them. Now that we've gone through all of the conversation types, I'd like you to take your card out again and go to the last little column that looks like this. And I would like you to check based on where your friend is on the curve, where their posture is, choose one of the two conversation types for that color. If you're not sure, choose the one on the left. It's always easier to catch up than it is to assume too much and back up. So go ahead and check that. And then under details, what I would like you to write is, what do you think it'd be helpful to talk about? So if you put chat, think of things that you could chat about with them. Maybe think about when you could chat with them, like, the next ball game, I'm going to sit next to them and ask them about their job, right? That can be your conversation plan. Or like me with Lucy that one time, I had checked sharing conversation, and I thought, what's a kind of a story from my life? What's something God's done in my life recently that might be helpful for her with where she is in her journey? And you could write those details down. And then, like I wrote at one point, the next time we get together, I'll look for an opportunity to talk about that. So go ahead and take a couple minutes, as you're doing right now, just to write out a little bit of a conversation plan. Okay, and as we come back together, just to summarize where we've come from, we said we wanted to demonstrate the ability to use the spiritual conversation curve by identifying a non-Christian. We've done that. Trying to begin to discern their spiritual posture. We've done some work there. Praying for that person. We stopped and we prayed for them. And then we created the beginnings, maybe the buds of a conversation plan that could perhaps blossom and give you some direction so that the next time that you are seated next to someone, or the next time you're driving in your car freaking out, thinking, I'm about to go walk with someone who doesn't share my faith, what should I talk about? You too can not only pray, oh Lord, help us both, but you can also mentally consult a simple model in your head to discern, how can I best be helpful for where they are? How can I serve them where they are? And hopefully this will help all of us be better, more faithful conversation partners to the people in our lives, and that we will be able to walk in wisdom towards those that God has put in our life. If you'd like to learn more about these things, a few resources that we have available at Lutheran Hour Ministries. One is you could order more of these curve cards. I know people who are in a Bible study and they're saying, let's all do this together. I have this card in my wallet. And so I always have it with me as a prayer prompt. Again, I would encourage you, if you maybe need more cards, feel free to get more and fill them out, keep them somewhere where you can be reminded to pray for that person. It's kind of funny, I helped develop this card, and yet every time I see it, it triggers my memory. And I'm like, oh yeah, I should be praying for Lucy. That's right. And so it helps me be more thoughtful and servant-hearted towards her. So you could get more of those. We have a Project Connect booklet that is out that is called How to Talk About Your Faith, an Introduction to the Spiritual Conversation Curve. And so it's just in booklet form, walking through this model. And then we have a fabulous online course, absolutely free, lhm.org/learn, called Prepare to Respond, that walks through this model. And we have videos of someone who's a new believer and two of the Christians who were their conversation partners, and they're talking about how this worked out in their relationship. It's fascinating interviews to see a new believer say to their Christian friend, okay, so when I was unreceptive, I was totally rude to you. What was that like for you? Like, why did you stick with me? And then to see the Christians ask the new believer, okay, when you were unreceptive, was there anything I did in conversation that was helpful for you? And then even more interesting, was there anything I did that was unhelpful for you? And they have this really honest interaction. All that's found within this online course where you can learn more about these things. Whether it's through these resources, whether it's through what God is doing in your life, my prayer is that all of us would be able to walk in wisdom towards the people God has put in our life.